For more on China, Germany, and China-European ties, we are now joined in our Beijing studio by Professor Wang Yiwei, who's the director of Center of EU Studies at China's Renmin University. Welcome, Professor. And also in Bonn, Germany, we have Mr. Josef Janning, head of the Berlin office and senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Welcome, sir. Meanwhile, in Brussels, we're also joined by Mr. Daniel Gros, director of the Center for European Policy Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Wow, we've seen European leaders coming back and forth between China and the European continent. Meanwhile, the Chinese President Xi Jinping has also been going that way. And Mr. Janning, what do you make of the recent, really frequent visits between the Chinese and the European leaders?
Well, Qianbei, it's an expression of the significance of both sides to each other's economic development. China is very important for Europe. China is one of the most attractive markets. It is a challenge to European industry. And on the other way around, Europe is very important for China's economic development, increasingly important for China's investment interests. And the two together, I believe, are a couple that is very much focused now on trying to lead the next phase of industrial development and not leave it just to the United States as so often.
What does that mean, Mr. Gros? The partnership between China and the European continent, particularly some of the key European countries, the UK included, of course.
But at the present, it's not really a partnership between the EU and China, but rather a partnership between China and individual nations. Although, and that's the strange thing, the EU is actually responsible for the core of this relationship, namely trade issues. But still, each individual country tries to be China's best partner in a sort of competition between the UK, France, and Germany. And that, of course, is all to the advantage of China.
Well, we've seen Chinese president going to the UK, Professor Wang, and of course now we see German Chancellor Ms. Merkel visiting China, and later President Hollande coming from France will be in China soon, and of course Chinese leaders will go to other European countries as well. From the Chinese side, what is the expectation? To what level can China really reach when it comes to partnership with key European countries, if not the EU?
Well, firstly, I think I disagree with my good friend Daniel Gros. Actually, European Union is partner for China. We have 4 partnerships: partner for peace, growth, reform, and civilization. This is the joint statement when President Xi visited Brussels last year. So we support integration of Europe. The bilateral relations with UK, France, and Germany, etc., is under the framework of the China-EU partnerships. So this afternoon, we just had the Bergenthof roundtable. Very pleased. Angela Merkel also visited us. We talked about the world order. I think she's very impressive to have dialogue with the Chinese scholars about the future of the world order and what kind of role China, Germany, and other European players can play in the future.
I know you asked her a question, so briefly tell me what the question is and how she answered, without giving all of the content, of course.
Yes. I think the German wisdoms, as we can learn many. She mentioned about the Silk Road and also mentioned about current situation. I think we can learn some lessons why Germany not only be number 1 world economy in Europe, but also an important security player. But this is not the situation in China. China is the winner of the Second World War as the number 1 trade partner and the number 1 economy in Asia. But the US-led bilateral airlines are not exclusive to China. So that's kind of, I think it's Chinese scholars raise that kind of concerns. And I think the Chancellor Merkel answered very smart that integration as for peace.
All right. I want you to catch your breath because I know you run all the way from that dialogue to our studio. So I will leave you for now and let me come back to you, Mr. Janning. what do you think about this apparent competition among key European countries, the UK, Germany, France, with its frequent recent exchanges with China? What do you think that would make these European countries in terms of their future directions?
Well, I see there is some ground for governments to engage, particularly when the trade and economic cooperation and investment environment is not really developed fully. And I think Merkel alluded to that in China, and you referred to that earlier. Once the investment agreement is there, and once Europe and China are moving closer to a free trade arrangement, then the perspective that Daniel Gros was making up will gain more ground, because then it is actually between the EU and China. For the time being, when industry still is very much focused on politics to help open doors and help bring about arrangements, that's when political leaders appear very often in this competitive environment. Over the long term, it doesn't make any sense. And you could see that very well in the case of the United Kingdom. The UK has no chance of remaining China's best partner in the West, which is a fancy title, if at the same time it chooses to turn its back on the European Union. Because, for China, the UK is important because it's part of this big market, of this big economic environment, and not because it is considering to be a little island on its margin.
Very interesting point. On the other hand, though, we see it comes both ways. On the one hand, China is willing to develop its further relations with the EU in terms of its partnership, as Professor Wang just mentioned. But there seems to be some political blockade over there still over the years. On the other hand, individual countries are very much interested in improving its trade and economic ties, particularly with China. So there seems to be, Mr. Gros, since you are now based in Brussels, that ever bigger gap over there between the European countries individually and the European Union. Is that gap likely to be filled? And by what?
No, I think there are various differences across member countries. For example, Germany sees China more as a market for its industrial goods. Italy is afraid of Chinese competition, whereas UK thinks its financial services can be of help and profit from the opening of the Chinese financial markets. So every country has a somewhat different view of how one should proceed. But if, on the other hand, China actually does what the colleague from Beijing proposed, namely that it says, for us, the EU is the main partner, the main person or the main body with which we want to do business, then I think these internal problems can be overcome. And it's significant that Merkel mentioned the EU-China investment treaty. It's no longer a German-China one, but an EU-China one. And if it then came really to a free trade zone between the EU and China, then I think these intra-European differences will have to disappear, and the bilateral relationship between Beijing and Brussels direct would become much, much stronger.
Okay, let me follow up, Mr. Gros. These kind of investment treaty is not very easy. Just look at the BIT between China and the United States. Nobody is expected to be reached very soon. So when you talk about China-European bilateral investment treaty, as Ms. Merkel just mentioned, is it going to be easy start? Or actually we should leave it a little bit later by developing bilateral ties, even though we're not excluding the so-called China-EU bilateral investment treaty? Mr. Gros, very briefly from you.
Yeah, I think even from the Chinese point of view, you cannot get a lot from each individual country in the EU. You're better off dealing directly with the EU. And I think here in Brussels, one should think about whether one should first go for investment treaty and then to free trade, and perhaps not do it the other way around.
Professor Wang here. Here's an interesting thing. It's not just the China-EU investment treaty that is now under discussion. It's also transatlantic treaty between the Europeans and also the United States. So how is the Europeans looking at them? Are the Europeans looking at themselves? And how are they looking at their partnership with the US, which is traditional, and their partnership with China, which is in fact thriving and new? It's an interesting balance. I want to have your Chinese perspective about these two paths growing at the same time, and where does China see its position?
Well, I think the Chinese position is in the value chain of the world production, from the very low and then now reach the middle. Some of them maybe like 5G maybe is at top. So China can have both good relations, economic relations with European Union and the European member states, and also with the United States. For instance, these visits, many European leaders visited China. It's independently. It's not just the competition with UK. I think they arranged half a year for different highlights. I think like a French president is more preparing for the Paris Climate Change Summit, and Angela Merkel is the government dialogue is regularly. It's the eighth time of her visit to China. And the UK, I think, because the member states of the European Union that have different comparative advantages towards China. For instance, the UK, I think the servers, particularly the financial servers, they can have more space to cooperate with China. And Germany with Chinese so-called also the Made 2025 innovation.
Yes.
And then I think lots of space to cooperate with Germany. That's the reason I think Chancellor Merkel visited Hefei. This is also a scientific city, a very good university there.
That's provincial
and
capital
the French
of Anhui
also,
province.
we can also lots of cooperate with France in discovering so-called the third-party market in Africa, even in UK, the nuclear plants.
Priorities could be different, and yet it seems that there has been an ever warmer relations between China and the EU member countries. Mr. Janning, let's talk specifically about Germany, which you're originally coming from. Of course, the car market here is huge in China, but besides that, new technologies, high tech coming to China from the European countries, majority of it coming from Germany. What does that, in a way, reflect about the nature of relations between China and Germany, particularly if you think about Ms. Merkel? This is already her 8th trip to the Chinese capital.
Yes, there are two sides to this. I think on the one hand, I think it is very smart for governments to establish processes of regular consultations, because that brings them together in a sort of a regular pattern without the need to create a special occasion. And it works very well for some other partners of Germany, and I think it is good policy. It is time well spent to regularly meet and exchange, because you do deal with a lot of issues beyond the immediate. On the industrial side, on the economic relationship, the car thing, that's Germany's #1 consumer product, and it's very attractive still. And the fact that China is catching up and trying to be as car-centric as countries in Europe and in the Western Hemisphere is to the benefit of the German industry. But the real thing is machinery, is the industrial cooperation, because that connects Germany intimately to the next stage of China's economic development, which is more about qualitative growth, technology-driven growth, innovation-driven growth. And Germany intends to provide the machine-building technology to this. And we will see an enormous amount of change in this sector in particular over the next 10, 20 years, which will probably revolutionize industrial production. And this is the core industrial perspective.
I see.
This is what the German industry is very keen about.
The German industry is very keen about this, and also about what the German call Industry 4.0, while China is looking at Made in China 2025, seem to be parallel with one another. Is there any chance of competition, or this is very, very complementary?
Both. I think for the competition, of course, when the Chinese catch up with the high technology innovation, of course, some competition, but it's very healthy. At the same time, Chinese market is very diverse, it's huge. For instance, I just come back from Urumqi. There, Volkswagen will
the provincial
invest.
capital of Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region.
They will invest automobiles. I think the Volkswagen, they can have 50,000 cars, maybe for taxis like in Shanghai. So still a huge potential for them to invest in China's inner side, particularly so-called the Belt and Road Initiative.
Right.
Those provinces now be the frontiers of the Chinese open reform, the more connections with Europe. So still many hopes.
But on the other hand, China is also willing to export its high-speed rail technologies, doing projects like that, and nuclear as well. Mr. Gros, there has been enormous amount of political, shall I say, hindrance in the European countries over the years about that. Is it likely to be solved with such frequent visits between the two continents, I mean between China and the European continent?
No, this will be very difficult. On nuclear power, we have, let's say, one half of the continent who has given up and the other half who wants to continue, but mostly with domestic technology, and the UK just being an outlier there. And on high speed, again, this was, so to speak, invented here, and I think there would be great resistance to opening up the market really to Chinese suppliers. And there will actually be stiff competition in the few countries around the world where high speed is still developing. So that's an area where I see more competition and cooperation.
Professor Wang, the chance?
Well, I think together, for instance, of the nuclear plant, actually 77% nuclear plants made constructed in China. So China is very efficient in building of such kind of facilities. But at the same time, the IPR maybe is in French hands. So they cooperate together to discover the UK market. So this is the win-win, not only win-win, but also try-win.
And what about high speed?
High speed also, the Germans, French, they also have some IPR. But recently we I think, succeeded in doing so of the 100% of the IPR of the Indians. But still, the export of the Chinese high-speed railway, Europeans also benefited from this.
All right, we'll see how things evolve. There's a lot to talk about when it comes to China and the European country. We certainly would love to have all of you gentlemen back to our program in the future. Thank you so much, Josef Janning, Daniel Gros, and Wang Yiwei here with us. Thank you so much, gentlemen.